Hey, this is Dave with Taboo Customs. In this video today, we're going to be taking on a pretty major undertaking. And that is, we're going to be installing a Dana 60 passenger side drop in our 95 Jeep Cherokee here. Now for this video, it's going to kind of be hit or miss. It's a lot of work doing this install. We'll try to talk about it as much as we can, but for the most part, we're really going to just be videoing us doing the install so you can kind of see how we did it. If you have questions on what we did do, you can get a hold of us on our website, taboocustoms.com, or on Facebook at our Taboo Customs Facebook page. So obviously for the first step in doing our custom suspension is clearing out the area for that. So we've already yanked out the Dana 30. There's another video out there if you're looking on how to remove your Dana 30. We did cover it on this vehicle, but figure it's kind of be pointless to cover it in this one since you're really probably here looking for custom suspension design instead of how to remove the damn Dana 30. A couple things we are going to still have to do. We do still have to remove the frame mount for the track bar, and then we will also cut off these lower control arm brackets because they won't be needed anymore. So beyond this, the next step is going to be working on stiffening up the center section of the Jeep. Okay, so for a lot of times when you're doing a design and a build that's this complicated, it's really hard to figure out where do you start. So for us, it's pretty much whenever we're building a custom front suspension, you typically will start with the transfer case mounting because with this vehicle here, we already know where the transfer case is going to be. So we need to start there and basically go from there. So in our design, we've done that the same way. We started with the transfer case. We said, okay, as we did the design, we said, how will we build this? And so with that, we actually have already started and we went in and we plated the Unibody side rails here, the Unibody frame essentially, and we've got plating that goes from the lower control arm mount for the front to the rear leaf spring mount, the shackle hanger at the front. We actually plate all the way under that shackle hanger, and then we'll tie it into the shackle hanger back there just to make sure that even the front and the rear suspension really has a lot tied into the body. Because this is really just a 14 gauge sheet metal body unless it's double wall thickness, where in a couple places it actually is. Now the front section we actually went with a 7 gauge stiffener because we're going to be using this as our mount for our cross member. So we've got holes and 4 weld nuts in each side of the body that we're going to be using to bolt that cross member to. Now as I mentioned, we started with the transmission mount here. So what we did is we made our tube for our transmission mount. Then we used that tube because we actually are going to bolt through that tube into one of these bolt holes. Then that allowed us to line up these sliders, or excuse me, these stiffeners here by using that bolt hole coming off of the transmission mount. That way we were basically just able to make sure that our transmission was where we want it in the long run, and we got these in place. So now the next step is we can start building the cross member. So with that, we'll start getting welding. All right, so before we start welding, let's go ahead and go through the structure of our cross member. Now we, like I said, we started with our tube here. We used a 2x4 tube with a 3/16 wall. And this time we really saved ourselves a lot of time because since we had the plasma table, we were able to go in, cut all of our holes in our tube, and really get everything to come out really clean. So here we've got our transfer case mounting. We've got the holes that, like I said, we used this hole here to actually line up our stiffeners, and then this tube basically will go down on our mounting plate here for the cross member. Now the stiffeners have this same 4-bolt pattern in the stiffeners with the nuts. Once we get this in place, we'll bolt these plates onto the bottom of the stiffeners. We'll get our transfer case mount here, our tube in place, And then again, we'll make sure that the transmission, transfer case, everything is where we want it, especially across the vehicle, left to right. And that's why you see we slotted this hole, because we didn't know exactly how much play we're going to need as we start to move that back and forth. So once we get it in place, we'll be able to weld this to this plate. Now once we have that welded to this plate, we'll start reinforcing this mount. So we've got an outside piece here, we've got a top plate, and basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to create a box. So we'll create a box here with outside, inside plates, and then the top plate. And we'll do that on both sides. So that way it'll give us a lot of torsional strength for this cross member, because for the most part we're going to want to resist the urge for this cross member to twist in the Jeep. So before we move on, let's talk a little bit about our alignment here. One thing on the Cherokees is that you might think that your yoke is actually centered between the unibody rails. It is not. It is actually skewed off to one side, and if you start measuring out your body here as far as where the tunnel here is, you'll find that the body and the tunnel are actually all skewed off to one side. So with that, you know, this whole pattern doesn't actually end up in the center of our tube, so we had to flip it around to get it to the right pattern. So once we had that all lined up, what we'll do next is we'll go in and we'll put some welds here along the cross member to these plates here. Make sure that they're welded on there good enough that they're not going to move, and then we'll go ahead and remove that cross member. We can build the rest of it on a bench, so we don't have to try to do it here while we are upside down. Now a couple other things to think about, because we've done this cross member in different locations, front to rear on the vehicle, in a couple of different Cherokees. You know, one of the big things to look at is your clearance for your transfer case. In our yellow Cherokee, we actually have this cross member slid back a little bit more, but in this Cherokee here, if we slid that back, we'd pretty much have zero clearance between the transfer case and the cross member, and you really want to make sure you have a decent amount of clearance, because as the engine torques, it's going to twist a little bit, and you don't want this transfer case running into that cross member. And pretty much, you know, with the 4x2 tube, the holes and the mount for the stock Cherokee, it fits pretty much perfectly right in front, and we have, with the way this is clocked, enough room for our CV joint up here, which is another thing you have to worry about if you put this cross member up in front of the transfer case here. So let's get to welding. Again, okay, we finished up welding our cross member up, and let's talk a little bit about, you know, why we welded the way we did. So obviously, you know, one of the things we did is we welded the tube to the plates that are going to be mounting to the bottom of the unibody first, and then we added this outside gusset. Now the reason for that is, even though this is 1/4 inch plate, we knew we were going to be doing a lot of heavy welding, and that 1/4 inch plate will still warp, especially since we're doing all the welding on this side of the plate and none on this side. So we added this here to act as a gusset to keep that from wanting to warp so much, you know. And then as we went ahead and we added, and you know, everything we solid welded that we could. You know, before we added these plates here, we completely solid welded this outside plate. That way I know we have this one plate on the outside that is, you know, tied in about as good as we can get it. Now on the rest of these plates, we solid welded the outside. Then we went on the inside and we welded. I tried not to fall over first. We welded as far as we could on the inside. You know, the biggest thing is to get the ends of the joints as good as you can, outside, inside, because a crack would probably start at the end of the joint. It's not going to really start in the middle of the joint. So now we can go ahead, we'll reinstall this cross member, double check the fit, and then we can start adding some link brackets. Alright, so we've taken our cross member, we've test fitted it back into the Jeep, and everything fits fine. So now the next step is we are going to start assembling our lower control arm mounts that are going to go on the cross member there. We're actually going to start assembling these on the bench because the way we've designed it, we can pretty much assemble it here on the bench, and then we're going to locate that assembly on the cross member. Now, through all of this process, until we get everything finalized, we're just going to tack things together because if we find out that we have some sort of interference that we didn't account for, we're going to have to kind of go back and refigure everything. So we don't want to solid weld anything until we for sure have everything squared away. So for our lower control arm mounts, we're using 1/4 inch plate. We've cut the outside plates, and they're 2 different lengths, and that's because whenever we create this mount, the mount is actually going to be angled outward towards the axle. It's not square to the cross member. It'll actually have a little bit of angle with it, and that'll help us to keep the axle centered under the Jeep and take a little bit of stress off of the track bar so much. So, and it'll actually it's also done because we have to clear the frame and a few other things. So what we've done here is we've gone in, we have used the ball from our Johnny joints to set the distance, and then we added 20 thousandths shim to one side to give us a little bit of extra space in here, so that we know we can get these in and out without having to beat them in or try to open this up a little bit. And then we've used our 9/16 bolt, tightened everything up. I only have nylock nuts here right now, so I put a couple washers under there just so I don't have to get down into the nylock. And then you know, for this, like I said, this is going to sit on that cross member like so. So we'll make sure that we are square. This back plate here will then bridge those 2 plates. Then this smaller plate here actually goes across the top to help us tie it in, but then gives us enough room up here to clear our joint. So I'll start getting those tacked together. Okay, so now we'll make our other one, and a big deal with that one is we're going to want to make sure we don't make 2 of one side. We make they need to have these plates on the opposite side. So get that done, and then we will actually tack them onto our cross member based off of the design that we showed you earlier. Okay, so now for the upper control arm mount at the cross member in the Jeep. It's a pretty simple mount. It's only made of 3 pieces. We've got 2 side plates here. When we design these side plates, you can see we designed them to go around the tube. That way we can weld on all 3 sides of the tube, basically as much as we can, to make sure that the joint here between this mount and the tube is solid and never going to have an issue. Because this link, you know, with the lower control arm links, you've got 2. You got 1 on each side distributing the forces there. But on the upper link with a 3 link, you're really just going to have that upper link that is resisting the rotation of that axle. So we need to make sure that our upper link mount is very solid. So pretty simple design, and we're going to use the tube to help align it. We're not going to tack it on just yet. We're actually going to do that later once we get the axle under the Jeep, because we have to check and make sure where we want to have the upper control arm mount actually on the axle. We're also going to use the actual Johnny joint, and I'll show you why here just in a second. Still using our 20 thousandths spacer. And then for this back plate, what we have is this plate is meant to go from the top here all the way down to the corner of the tube, and then this section will actually be down along the back side of the tube. That way we can get a weld along here as well to tie this back strap into the tube. Now the reason why we went with the actual Johnny joint here instead of just the inner section is, you know, in our design we were making this clearance here pretty close. So I want to make sure that I've got at least a 1/4 inch to 3/8 of clearance here, basically enough to essentially stick my pinky finger down in, and then we'll go ahead and we will tack these together, and then we can start getting our lower control arm mounts on our cross member. Alright, so there we go. There's our upper control arm mount. Like I said, we're not going to put that on until we align up our axle and see where our upper control arm falls out. On that side, we've got a few things that we've got to contend with. One being the exhaust. We need to make sure we make room for the exhaust to go next to that upper control arm mount. So we got to figure that out. So the next step is we'll go ahead and we'll put our lower control arm mounts on the cross member. Alright, so we pulled the cross member mount out of the Jeep, and now we're going to go ahead and we're going to locate these lower control arm mounts. Now what we did is we went into the design that we did and we measured where the lower control arm mounts are in the design, and we did that off of the transfer case mount. So we know that this end, this tube here, and all of this assembly here, you know, there's a chance that that stuff's off a little bit more, but that transfer case mount, you know, once we had it where we wanted it, that's not really going to move, that's not going to float. So we went ahead and we're going to measure off of there. So I've already put some marks here for my mounting for my transfer case. I'm going to go ahead and measure off of that. Now one thing that you know, we'll do as fabricators a lot of times is when you're using a tape measure here, to try to measure off this very end can be a pain. It'll cause some measurement errors. So what we'll often do is we'll go to one of the marks here, and I'm going to go to the 2-inch mark, and I'm trying to go over 9.1, so I'm actually going to go to 11.1 because I added an inch. Now that I've got that located, and what I did is I measured off of this hole to basically this point right here in my design, you know, and by looking at the print, you know, puts us pretty much right where we're expecting to be. Go ahead and do the other side. And we can now tack them on. So that should give us our lower control arm mounts. Now we'll put this back in the Jeep and we can start working on getting that front axle in. When we do install this back in the Jeep, we're going to go ahead and put this up here, but we're not really going to put it in place just yet, but we want it up there so that we can easily slide it back and forth once we get things going with the front axle. Alright, we've got the cross member reinstalled now, and the next step we're going to do before we start getting our front axle in place is we're going to have to remove the old lower control arm brackets from the unibody. Now these brackets are usually in a lot of places are a couple thicknesses thick. We're going to use a plasma cutter, and our goal is basically, you can see our arm's going to come right through this area, and the arm will clear the unibody, but there's a good chance that it would come into contact with this, so we're going to need to take it off. Now the biggest thing with this is that you don't want to cut into the base unibody, so we want to just make sure that we take this off. Now there's pieces on the outside here that are angled, and those are the pieces you really have to be careful of. if we were to take our plasma cutter and try to cut through this right here, we're going to end up cutting into the base. So we're not going to do that. We're going to cut this down here, and then we'll see where we can go from there with the plasma cutters. Alright, so there you have it. A lot of things to consider when you're doing this as far as safety versus hot work, catching fire to things. You know, we stopped frequently to try to make sure that, you know, anywhere we were throwing sparks, we weren't catching anything on fire, because, you know, you might have seen from our videos, sometimes we do that. The other thing is, you know, watch all the hot crap falling on you. Doesn't feel great. So now we got to get the other one cut off, which is going to be just as much fun, but we won't subject you to that torture. We'll just get her done, and then we'll get to putting the front axle in. Alright, so now we've got all of the parts cut for our control arm mounting for the axle, as well as the coil spring mounting. There's still a few things we have left to design, but this is basically the next step. It's going to be getting these assemblies, the sub-assemblies, somewhat made, and we're going to use the front axle to help us to line some of these up, because we're going to have several cases where we need to align multiple radiuses, and this will help us to be able to do that. So we're going to start out with the coil spring mounts, then we're going to do the upper control arm mount, and then we're going to do the 2 lower control arm mounts. Okay, so before we do the second one, we'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit about the design of this coil spring mount. We've designed it with 3 ribs underneath, because this is, you know, taking the weight of the Jeep pretty much. So we've got 3/4 inch ribs. It'll mount to the top of the axle. This plate back here is actually what we're going to mount our shock off of. We haven't designed our shock mounting yet, but once we do, it'll be basically off of this back plate. Got our large plate the coil spring is going to sit on, a hole over here for a coil spring retainer, and then we have our bump stop here in the middle of the coil spring. They'll keep the coil spring centered, then also should hit our bump stop too at the top of the coil spring. And basically, once we get done with the axle here, we got to cut these pieces off. They'll, you know, basically install just like that over here in this spot in the axle. Now, the driver's side is a little bit different. On the far inside of the coil spring mount, we've got to use a special plate, and that's because on the the passenger side here, there was a leaf spring mount. So we're going to cut some of that leaf spring mount off, but we're unable to get down to the tube because we've got the casting there. We're going to make it as much clearance as we can for this, but as you can see, we're still going to have to mount on top of that. And here, once we get done assembling all this, we're going to go through cutting all of the parts off the axle. Okay, so there we have it, our driver and passenger side control arm mounts, lower control arm mounts. Passenger side is a little bit more tricky on this axle, because this mount actually will go on the tube and over into the center section area. So we'll actually have to do a little bit of trimming here to this lip on the center section so that sits flat. So I really only lightly tacked this one, because we might have to play with that. So now for the next step is we're going to have to start cleaning up this axle. So what we're going to do, we're going to remove this leaf spring perch, these shock mounts. There's a little mount up here, and then we also have to cut some of this this leaf spring perch on the passenger side. Then we are also going to go in and go ahead and weld these the center section, the tubes to the center section. Now, obviously, on welding to center sections, there's going to be a lot of information on the internet. You know, and we've done welding on the center sections a lot. Now you got two main types. You're going to have cast iron, you're going to have cast steel. Honestly, neither of them weld like normal mild steel. So you are going to have to take some factors into account when you are welding on a center section. It's cast iron, there's quite a few more. But luckily, I believe most of the Navy 60s are actually cast steel. And there's a lot of ways the internet will tell you how to figure that out. But for us, we've been grinding on it a little bit just to see if, you know, there's a different amount of sparks in the tube versus the center section. And whenever we start welding, we'll actually do a couple little test welds in areas to make sure that we know what we're working with, and then we'll know how to deal with it. At a minimum, we're going to do some preheat the welding and then let it cool slowly. So let us get started on that. Alright, so I don't know if my phone recorded removal of the brackets here or not. We use a plasma cutter, basically remove them. You can do that, just be careful you don't get too much into the tube. The good news is if you do get in the tube, you can weld it up. Just, you know, make sure you don't blow a hole in it, especially with the plasma cutter, especially the big one. Then, as I mentioned, I had to cut some of the passenger side leaf spring perch off, basically the chunks there. You know, and I wish in the middle of it, I wish I'd just taken the steering off and used my portable bandsaw to go in here and cut it. It would have been a little bit easier, a little bit, you know, save some time. Here, I basically had to go in, cut some strips in here, and then cut it this way, and then slice it, and then basically break off all the chunks until I could get down to where I want. Now, the reason we had to do that is that our our coil spring mount needs to go there. Now, we thought about trying to mount the coil spring mount, of course, on top of this, but in looking at the angles, we actually need a slightly different angle to get our steering right, rather, you know, that wasn't set up by that leaf spring perch. So we went ahead and just designed what we wanted, and then figured we'd cut out what we didn't. So it actually worked out pretty well perfect. The brackets we cut fit over it with just some minor trimming, and looks like it should all work out. So now the next step is to get this big hunk of steel under the Jeep and start seeing where we fall. Alright, so now it's time for us to weld up the center section to the tubes, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a torch, and we're going to try to heat up the center section right in just this area. You gotta be careful because you do have a seal over here, so you don't want to get it too hot, but we're quite a ways from that here. We're a good 5 inches or so, and we're going to try to hit about 200 degrees at least before we weld this. We're probably going to do it in sections, because chances are, you know, I'm not going to be able to get the whole thing up to 200 degrees without really getting it all hot. So we'll probably do it in 2 or 3 sections, and we'll see how it goes. Okay, so that does it for one side. The goal, you know, we wrap the weld blanket around it when we're done to allow it to cool slowly. The main thing is, you know, you're trying to keep micro cracks, bigger cracks, from occurring in the cast section. So now we'll just repeat the process on the other side. Well, it's finally the time to start really, you know, figuring out where we're going to put this front axle onto this Jeep. So with this, we're really going to be looking at 3 main things. One is the, you know, distance, the wheelbase here, so that it matches up not only with the springs here, but we keep a consistent wheelbase on both the left and right, because we want this axle, of course, in here perpendicular to the Jeep as possible. We want it to track straight. The other thing is getting this axle, you know, getting the correct track under the Jeep, the correct distance this way. The third thing that we're really going to be setting up here is going to be the caster angle. And now that's the angle that this axis here, the steering axis, is at in relation to the front or rear of the Jeep. Now for steering, you want this tilted back. Usually 5 to 7 degrees is what you're shooting for. And the reason for that is that with it tilted back, that's what helps to center your steering wheel as you're driving down the road. Now this Jeep isn't going to be driven a whole lot on the road, so it's not a huge issue, but you still, for good suspension geometry, for good geometry in general, want to try to maintain that. Of course, that's something we'll look at, but then we'll also look at our pinion angle, because that's really what's going to set our pinion angle. Right now we should be pretty close, I think, to the caster that we want, because whenever we designed this, we designed these to pretty much be at the right caster, and that looks pretty good. So we're going to go through, we'll set all those measurements right now, and then we will go ahead and we'll start tacking on some of our mounts onto the axle. The first thing we're going to start with is this passenger side lower mount, and the reason for that is when we designed it, we had to go around the center section. So that center section is really going to set the distance underneath here. Same thing for this coil spring mount as well. The plate down here is really going to set the distance for that. Once we get this axle centered, we're going to make sure that we've got this really centered up underneath here. If we are off by any more than an eighth or a quarter, we're going to end up having to trim some more, but hopefully we won't have to do that. Once we get those two set, then we'll basically measure off the back of the knuckle here, or not the knuckle, but the C that the knuckle is attached to, and we'll set the distance on the other side just to make sure that we're even on both sides. So let's get to work. Okay, so we've measured and we've now tacked our lower mounts and our coil spring mounts on. And one thing we noticed, as we were working on this passenger side here, is that when we drew up the design in SolidWorks, we didn't really draw up the center section very accurately. You saw that there's ribs in that center section that we didn't count for, so we had to do quite a bit of grinding to get our mount to where we wanted it, but we did manage to get it where we wanted it. The same thing with the coil spring mount. It fit pretty well, actually. Then we moved to the other side, set our angle and set our distance the same as this side, and once we tacked that on, we actually had to cut it loose and move it because we were off about an eighth of an inch. So, but we've now got that all set up. We'll now re-square up the axle in the Jeep, and then we'll measure for our lower control arms, and we'll take you over and we'll start making those. Alright, so now we're ready to make our lower control arms. If you were good or lucky, your lower control arms came out to be the same length on the left and the right. And after we got our axle squared back up in the Jeep, we measured it out, and they did. They came out to be the exact same length on the bottom, so hopefully that means we did a good job, or we could have just been lucky. So we need to make control arms that are 35.5 inches long. Before we start doing that, though, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're going to be using. So I like to use Johnny joints from Curry, Rock Jock. They've always held up well for me. And the structure of the Johnny joints, we've actually got a couple of them here. We will typically use on our control arms one adjustable end and one fixed end. That's because once we get these set, typically you're not going to be adjusting them that much. So we like to have this set up because it's, in my opinion, a little bit stronger. You don't have to worry about jam nuts on the other end, just one end that's adjustable and could possibly loosen up. So as for a structure of a Johnny joint, here we've got the fixed end, and it's basically just a DOM tube that's been machined out, has a lip at the bottom and a ring up here at the top. Now inside this Johnny joint, what you'll have is you'll have this urethane bushing that goes in there, and then you'll have your ball that goes in the center, and you'll have another urethane bushing over top. Now, important thing on these urethane bushings, if you're assembling them, is there's an inner and outer ring on these, so you have to make sure you get those lined up exactly correct, because if you're putting that together and you can't see it, if you get them like this, it's not going to go far enough in. You force it in and it's going to be a massive pain. So you got those two. You'll basically then get a washer over top, and you've got a large snap ring here that'll, can't see that, a large snap ring here that'll go in the outside, just like this one here. Now of course this one being the adjustable one, it's a cast piece that they have then machined the threads into and machined the bore on. So so with that, let's talk a little bit about the adjustable end. Now on this end, we will buy the bushing with the threads already in it. It's a lot easier than trying to find someone that has the taps to be able to tap your large tubes. And what we'll do is we'll try to leave at least a ½ inch of space up here. Now we've got to account for a jam nut, so you've got to remember to, you know, account for your jam nut. But the biggest thing is what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we keep the most threads engaged here as possible. So with that much space up here, that still leaves us, if we need to go out, a little bit of room, you know, and we probably wouldn't want to go in farther than 3/8 or ½ inch. We want to make sure we have probably 3/4, probably quite a bit of, you know, a majority of this the threads here in contact, so you know we don't make a weak point that can break. So as far as how we determined the length of our tubes, and for our tube, what we're using is we're using a DOM steel tube. It's a 2-inch overall diameter with a 1/4 inch wall. So these are machined to a 1.5 inches, and so that will slide right down in there and we can weld it up. Now you could go to a bigger, but if you are using this and you go to a bigger tube and you go to like a 2.5 inch with a 1/2 inch wall, that tube is massive and it is extremely heavy, and for 99.99% of what most people are doing, going to be massively overkill. So this is what we typically will use for our lower links and our upper link as well. So one thing, you know, how do you determine how long you need to cut your tube? So what we will do is we know we need to make links that are 35.5 inches long. So we'll go ahead and make a mark on our table here. And then we'll make another mark 35.5 inches away. So with our bushing here where we want it, we will line up our Johnny joint with the far mark. We'll line up this one with the other mark, and then from there we can go ahead and mark where the edge of that tube is going to be, and then we can measure out what our tube length is going to be. So for instance here, it's going to be about, right at about 31 inches. So what we did is then we went over and cut some tube that was 31 inches long. Now for this end, what we're going to do is we're going to end up going in, doing a V cut here with a cutoff wheel, and then kind of grinding this out to make a nice smooth radius so that we get a good weld. So let's get started. Okay, so we've gotten a little far ahead of ourselves and didn't get some video here, but where we're currently at is we've got the axle under the Jeep. We went ahead and we installed our lower control arms. We built our upper control arm. We actually located our control arm mount, and we tacked it in place. Now for our upper control arm, one of the big things is we have to miss the unibody frame. So the unibody frame, if you didn't, you could clean up a little bit more of it and probably get closer to it if you take the more of the mount off, but we really just took the bottom section off. I don't want to cut into the unibody frame very much because I don't want to weaken it at all. So we're pretty much, our upper link is parallel with the Jeep, and we tacked our upper mount with it pretty much parallel to the caster, you know, the upper and lower kingpin, the line that you would make through there, the axis. This is pretty well parallel to that. So now our next steps is we've got really 3 more things that we've got to get squared away before we can pull this axle out and finish weld everything up. And one is the hydraulic assist steering ram, which we're going to do next here. The other is the track bar mount, which we're currently waiting on some joints for that to come in before we really get that squared away. And then the other is the shocks. So right now let's take a look at the hydraulic ram assist. Now the hydraulic ram assist that we've got came off of another Jeep. The customer sent it with this Jeep to us, so we're really taking what we've got and we've got to figure out a way to make it work. Which in all actuality, I mean, this ram is, you know, a pretty compact ram. And on ours we actually use a fairly large ram, but this one's pretty small. And we want to connect that ram to the tie rod. We don't really want to connect it to the drag link, because the drag link will move a lot more than the tie rod. The tie rod's obviously going to stay parallel to the axle. However, as we mount this, there's a lot of things we have to watch out for. We know that we want that ram to be as parallel to the tie rod as we can get it, so that we don't cause any twisting in the tie rod as I shake my camera a whole bunch. We also need to be careful of where we mount it, because we're going to have the track bar running back here, so we can't really mount it on the back side, which it would be the best place to put it so that we're protected, but we can't really do it back here because we'll have our track bar in the way. So we've got to do it on the front, but we've got to be careful of the drag link, because as this passenger side goes up, this V here at the drag link is going to come together, and we don't want that to come down on our hydraulic assist. So what we have decided is that for our axle mount, we're going to build it off the upper control arm mount. Now we are going to tie it down into the tube a little bit more. However, this upper control arm mount is already pretty solid. So we'll mount the back end, if I can get my plates the right way, off of the upper control arm mount like that. We've got this just far enough out that with it straight, we clear enough of the bolts so we can actually remove this cylinder. And then for our tie rod mount, we're actually going to mount over here pretty much right in front, and you can't see that because of the shadow, right in front of the pumpkin. Now we've got it angled down on the tie rod, so we're hoping that as our axle goes up, we will clear this drag link. Now we won't really know until we cycle the suspension once we get the track bar on it. So we're kind of going off of a hoping and experience, and we believe it should clear. So for the next steps, we're basically just going to get all that tacked up. You know, another thing we did is we also put the fittings towards the back so that we can route our hoses back here, and what we would probably do is be able to zip tie those to the track bar, and the hoses will have to mount. Now we'll have to make sure we have enough slack in those, though, that as the suspension cycles, we have enough slack to clear that. So we'll get everything cleaned up and start getting things tacked up. You can see, you know, how we did our hydraulic assist. We've got it up quite a ways, so it shouldn't take too many hits, but we could still build a guard underneath it if we need to. You know, with ours we have a guard built underneath it, but we also rock crawled with our Jeep, so we're going to take a lot of hits. And you can see here, you know, we should clear our drag link as we cycle, but again, that's something that we're going to have to test. And then we can also still get our diff cover off. You know, if you just turn the wheels to the left, this will move over. And when we set this up, what we did is we we put the wheel straight, and then we set our midpoint on our cylinder here so that, you know, this is an 8-inch cylinder, so there's 4 inches showing there. So now that we have that, we basically figured out where we want, and we'll go from there, and once we test it, we will get everything solid welded. So the next step is going to be setting up our track bar and then also our shock mounts. Okay, take 2 of our suspension test here. So we've gone in and we've done a few things. We have modified our coil spring centers on the bottom there to be a little bit taller so that we can make sure that we're going to hit the pads at the top, which chances are with the springs we're running we'll never really get there, but at least I want to make sure I at least try. We've also added our shock mounts down here. So one of the things we're testing here is that seeing if our shock mount actually hits the the control arm down there, which it does not. So we're good with the shock mount, and obviously the suspension pretty much won't be able to drop this far. We're going to have to limit it before it gets there, because at that point that spring would pop out and it's not going to go back in right. So looking underneath, we look pretty good. Our track bar does get close to the oil pan, but it's not close enough that we need to worry. And here you can see the how close and where we get with the passenger side. So it looks pretty good. Now we're going to lift up the driver's side and make sure that we've got everything fixed there. Okay, so now for the track bar mounting, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the axle side here, and we've already made our bracket. We've assembled it as far as we could, mainly because we want to make sure we got the width right. We got a little spacer in there for the heim joint. We are using heim joints on this one. The track bar does not undergo the same amount of stress as our control arms, and it really just works to keep the axle straight underneath. So we are using it, and the heim joints are a little bit smaller, so a little bit easier to work with because this is a really tight space. Now for the mounting on this axle, we've got this block on top here has 2 threaded holes in it, so we are actually going to use one of those bolt holes. We aren't going to use the second one because our mount ends up falling right on top of it. So we're going to put this bolt threaded hole. So basically right now what we're going to do is we're going to bolt a plate to the top of it, and then later on we're actually going to weld that plate on it. The bolt is really there for a secondary method, because this whole mount will pretty much just be welded to the cast section of the axle, which is a little bit concerning. And so we're going to do what we can to make sure that we shore that up. 1, by bolting it, and 2, by once we pull this out, we're actually going to run a tube across to the other axle tube. That way we give it a little bit more strength. Okay, so now we've got that bolted down, we've pretty much designed this bracket here to go on top of that plate, run down the side here, and then go across the bottom. And then on the top here, we're going to run about over to the center line of the axle, the pumpkin actually. And with that, we're going to put it basically as close to that bolt as we can go and still have our socket fit on the bolt, which is right there. Now on this end we did put our adjustability because we're not quite sure how high we can go with our track bar. The main thing about installing the track bar is, one, we want it, if in a perfect world, it'd be in the same length, same angle, same position as your drag link. That way you cancel out any bump steer. However, in the real world, you usually end up kind of just fitting it wherever it'll fit, and try to hope for the best as far as getting it into the same angle, same length. And that's what we've got to do here. Now we've got 2 things to worry about. We've got to worry about the spring, making sure the spring will clear between this mount and the spring, obviously, and then being able to get our bolt, get to our bolt here. So pretty much right there is where we need to be. We left our helmet on the other side of the Jeep. Alright, so now that we've got that in place, we can work on our frame side. Alright, so here we've got the frame side, and you'll have to excuse us. We did a video, didn't turn the sound on. You know, happens more than we'd care to admit. So on the frame side, what we had to deal with here is we did use the existing track bar mounting. That's 2 bolts up here at the top, 2 bolts down here at the bottom. They're fairly large bolts and definitely substantial enough to hold the track bar mounting. Now, you've got a couple options. In the past, we've taken the existing track bar mount, cut the stuff off the bottom of it, and actually welded to the bottom of that mount. You know, that has worked fine for us. With this one, though, we did go ahead and build a complete new mount. So we had a plate at the top, at the side, plate on the bottom, and then we've got assembly here. Now with the assembly, we had to kind of, actually the frame comes out here, so we had to angle this assembly to this plate, and then we tacked it up here. Now we had to move it quite a ways forward to make sure that we cleared the spring over here as well. And as you can see, we've actually got this, you know, pretty tucked up pretty tight to the bottom of the body. And that's because with our link over here on the top, we noticed that whenever this is at ride height, it gets pretty close to that. So we've got to watch and be careful of that whenever we're designing this. Now for our next step, we'll basically have to go in, we'll make the track bar here, and then we can start testing and seeing what kind of interferences we might have. Okay, so now we've got our driver's side up and our passenger side down, and you can see it's down a long ways. We would have to limit it a whole lot sooner than that, especially on this passenger side because of the drive shaft being on this side. You know, a couple times with these suspension setups in the Cherokees, I've had to run different length limiting straps depending on where the drive shaft is, just to make sure we don't bind that drive shaft. Now, one thing I should have mentioned earlier is that in addition to this axle shifting across the Jeep, what you're going to get is as one of these tires goes down, you'll get some movement front to rear of the Jeep. So in this case here, with this tire as it comes down, the axle moves to the rear a little bit. So you know, that's one thing you really have to watch. You want to minimize it. In this design, it's actually pretty good. To this extreme, it's moved about an inch back, which isn't bad, you know, because we aren't going to go this far once we do go to this this design and get it limited. Now on the driver's side, you can see we have it shoved way up in there, and there's a couple of things to note here once we get underneath the Jeep. One is I noticed that our upper link at the far back actually hits the frame where the control arm mount used to be, which you know, being the amount that the axle is sliding across the Jeep, you know, we're going to be able to limit that or reduce it here once we change some track bar mounting, and hopefully we don't hit that, or we do have the ability to go ahead and adjust that. The other thing we noticed is that we do have quite a bit of space here between the track bar mount and the upper link, so we should be able to drop that track bar mount down, you know, at least a couple inches, which will greatly help. So that's what we're going to go in and do. We're going to go ahead and redesign that track bar mount, and then see where we end up. Okay, so now we can see that we've made our frame side of our track bar quite a bit taller. We've dropped it down about 2 inches. We've actually added about 1.5 inches to the length of the track bar for now. We just screwed it, but we're actually going to have to cut it in 2 for that. And you can see that our angle on our track bar turns out a whole lot better. It's a lot more parallel, and now our track bar actually has more clearance to the oil pan than our drag link does. Obviously, we're up higher than we'll be able to go with the actual suspension, but it looks a whole lot better with the passenger side up now. Now we just need to put the driver's side up and see how it looks. Okay, so here it is with the driver's side up, passenger side down. So we still have the issue where it runs into the frame back where the lower control arm was mounted, so we will have to notch that out, cut a little bit more of that control arm mounting out, which isn't a problem. It's not part of the actual unibody. You can see we have good clearance between the upper track bar and the upper control arm mount, but we do still have an issue and it's not when it's flexed out, but it's more when it's just cruising along down the trail and hits some bumps. So we'll put it back at right height and we'll show you what that issue is. Alright, so here's the issue we're looking at, is that if the right side doesn't drop very much, but the left side here, the driver's side, goes up about 4 or 5 inches, we get to a case where our upper control arm mount does come into contact with the track bar mount, which obviously we don't want. You know, and we've got some extended bump stops, but at that, the extended bump stops aren't enough to keep that from happening. So I think what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead, raise these up another inch and a half. What I'm probably going to do is start to taper it up inside the spring and give this a little bit more height, so we can make sure that, you know, if the spring does actually collapse, and honestly, chances are that we're going to be running some tall springs. Springs probably aren't going to go up that high, but we definitely don't want to have any metal-to-metal contact with anything. So just a reassurance, we're going to go ahead and make those bump stops a little taller. Alright, so here we are at the end of the build. We did get our 6.5 inch lift springs. We had to switch from a 5.5 inch coil spring to a 6.5 spring. And then what we did is we also bought new isolators for the top. One thing is you can check when you're doing any kind of front suspension work on your Cherokee, or if you have a Cherokee where you want to add maybe just a hair more lift in the front, you can check out your isolator, because a lot of times on these isolators, you've got an isolator like this, it was pretty much stretched out and really wasn't doing much. These isolators will actually add about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch of lift if they're brand new. So we went to the 6.5 inch springs, these isolators, to make sure we got a little bit extra lift. The front is still a little bit lower than the rear, but typically what we found is leaf springs will settle in a little bit more than coil springs. Once you've got this set up, it's pretty much not going to go anywhere. So as for the suspension itself, you know, we spent probably about 40 hours on this suspension. Now, some of that was some design time, obviously building our transfer case mount, which had multiple uses, obviously, from that transfer case and our suspension, also doing our hydraulic assist. So there were some extra things in there. As far as cost on doing something like this, you can do it cheap, but you know, really, you know, it's cheap, fast, or good. And a lot of times we want to pick good rather than cheap or fast. And honestly, this would probably never be fast, even if you did do it cheap. However, you could probably do this if you really wanted to do it cheaply for $500. This one here is more like between $1,000 and $1,500. And if you want to do it right, really, that's probably where you're going to be at, is up in that range. At least. Now that's before we go and buy our drive shaft. Our drive shaft for this is probably going to be another $400 to $500, because you do want a quality drive shaft if you're planning on running 1-ton axles. Alright, thanks for watching, and you know, if you have any questions on the front suspension here, 1-ton swap, or suspension work, you know, you can get a hold of us on our website, taboocustoms.com, or on our Facebook page or Instagram. Get a hold of us and send us any questions you might have. All right, thanks.